even without seeing you, we are still thrilled that you were joining us tonight.
Thank you. I'm sure it's my fault. I'm so techno challenged. It's ridiculous, but I'm all set up here and ready to go if the camera ever chooses to cooperate. So thrilled to be here, and thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, we're super excited, but for some of our readers that are new to you, hard as that might be to believe, other than being tech challenged, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got started writing?
Well, the number one thing tonight is I'm tech challenged, but no, I got started writing when I got fired from my job. And I was working for the ABC affiliate in Dallas, Channel 8. And I was on a program called PM Magazine. And I was an on-air contributor, but one day they came through and fired all of us and said they needed fresh faces. So my husband at the time said, you now have time and opportunity to do what you've always wanted to do, and that's to write fiction, because I've been such an avid reader all my life. And I always said, oh gosh, I just love to be able to write a book. So we literally set up a card table with a typewriter and a ream of paper. And that's when I started. And I didn't know that I could do it, but I had such a fire in my belly to do it. And so I started as though it were a paid job, even though at the time it wasn't. I had two toddlers crawling around, underneath me, but I started writing books, and lo and behold, there was an editor named Vivian Stevens, to whom I owe a debt of gratitude that I could never repay, who was starting a line at Bantam Doubleday Dell called Ecstasy. And I said, well, that sounds great. So I threw a woman I met, now my best friend forever, for life, but she owned a bookstore, and she sent my first manuscript to Vivian Stevens and said, you need to publish her. So when I sent my manuscript in, Vivian Stevens called me and said, I want to buy this book, and do you have anything else? And by that time I'd written another, and I sent it to her, and she bought that second book within 13 days of the first one. So, and that's where I started in series romance, and then progressed from there. I hope it's progressed. I think it's progressed from there.
Well, that was one of the questions I did want to get into, with where you started back in the 80s. And I have some of those books, and since the recording, I've got Hidden Fires here as one of my old copies here.
Yeah.
But then as you've progressed from the pure romance to the suspense, the thrillers, the mystery, what has actually writing novels taught you as you've gone through all of this, especially the change over the years?
Well, at one point in my career, I became very concerned about certain trends. And it was like, okay, everybody's doing humor. Well, my stories tended to be more like, the Greek tragedies. And so I was like, oh my gosh, I'm telling editors, I want to write about, a son and a stepmother, and my editors are going, oh my gosh, you can't do that. I mean, oh my gosh. And everybody's writing funny books, but I had funny, like, haha, but I had an editor who said, Sandra, nobody does quite what you do. And so you have to do what you do. And trends will come and go, but stay true to your heart. Listen to your voice. What is your voice telling you to do? And so I thought that was pretty good advice, and I have followed it. And so in terms of what writing novels has taught me is, number one, how truly difficult, how truly hard it is, and how I have been so blessed with the ability to maintain the longevity. I've been at it a long time, but I've always remained true to my voice. It may not be what's in vogue at the time, but it's what I do. And it's what I think I do with some level of competency. And so I've stuck with it. And so her advice I really took, and I've remained true. At the same time, I know how hard it is, because Overkill is the 84th book I've had published. It's my 74th New York Times bestseller. So I have to tell myself every single day, you kind of know how to do this. But every single day that I come to the keyboard, it's like I've never done it before. And it's that fear factor. And I think that fear factor is really healthy, because it has over 4 decades, it has kept me published. And in the publishing industry, longevity is something to be coveted. So that's a long answer to your question, but that's it.
It's okay. No. You've also talked before, and along those lines, that you have various essential elements for all of your books. Can you discuss a little bit what those actually are?
Yeah. I was on tour last week, and somebody had asked me that same question. And they said, what are the 4 elements? I said, oh gosh, I hope I can remember them, put on the spot like this. But number 1, your main characters have to share space. They have to be. And now this is a Sandra Brown book. This isn't a book for any other author. This is a classic Sandra Brown read. The 2 characters have to be together in as many pages as you can possibly put them together. They have to be together. So shared space. There is a codependency. And by that, I mean that the female will have a goal. The male will have a goal. If it's really good story, they will be at cross purposes to achieve their goals, because there has to be that conflict. On the other hand, they're codependent on each other. In other words, one can't achieve his or her goal without the other. And it's a reluctant codependency. Oh my God, I'm going to have to put up with her. Oh my God, I'm going to have to put up with him. But it is a codependency in order for them to achieve their goal. Third one is the desire, sexual desire, which is a given. I mean, it's a Sandra Brown book after all. So they're going to have the hots for each other. But the 4th, and probably the most important element, it has to be forbidden.
Okay.
If she's a fireman, he has to be an arsonist, because it has to be totally forbidden. If it weren't forbidden, you'd have no story. If it weren't forbidden, it would be easy for them to have the hots for each other and everything to work out great. But that forbiddenness is, I think, the key ingredient. They cannot be suited. And so I've built my career on those 4 elements. And when I start plotting a book, I say, okay, why are they codependent? How in the heck am I going to get them to share space for 450 pages? The desire, he's great, she's great. They're going to want each other. Why can't they have each other? Oh, because he's a fireman and she's an arsonist. I mean, it has to be that diametrically opposed.
Well, and one of the things that I thought was really different with Overkill, it seems like there were probably different challenges in this book, because it's not exactly the classic mystery thriller, right? I mean, very early on who the bad guy is, right? But it seems the real villain is this, in a way, is the moral dilemma that Zach has to go through in figuring things out.
Well, that's very insightful, Samantha, because the challenge for me when I started thinking of the plot, and I thought about it during COVID, when families, God bless them, were being put through decisions like this. And I thought, gosh, what awful. And you say, well, it would be a mercy. Conceptually, pulling the plug, to put it very crudely, pulling the plug would be considered, in many cases, a mercy. But if you were the one that actually had to sign the paper,
right,
to do that, then it becomes not conceptual, it becomes actual. And so I thought, oh my gosh, what a horrible dilemma to be in. But the people on the nightly news, their names might not have even been mentioned, but we all saw their story and we all empathized with their story. But then the next night there was another story, but what if, which is what all authors play, what if that person, that individual who had to make that heart-wrenching decision was a celebrity, a People magazine cover, a Entertainment Tonight personnel. I mean, somebody that everybody knew. And he was having to make this decision in a global arena with a spotlight on him. Then it would become different. I mean, his dilemma would be compounded. So when you talk about the villain in this book, and no, it's not a whodunit, because we know the bad guy early on. That's no surprise. It is a moral dilemma. My challenge was to incorporate a moral dilemma book into a suspense thriller, which is what my readers expect. But who is the real villain in this book? It's not Evan. It's Zach's conscience. That's what he's wrestling with through the entire book. And Evan Clark, who is the villain, he's the one who done it, but he is only an embodiment, a personification of the real villain, which is Zach's conscience. So I had to factor in, okay, so here I've got Zach Bridger, this hunka burning love, MVP, Super Bowl quarterback, living the life. He's got it life by the tail, he really, and then this crashes down on him. And I had to somehow embody a villain, and that's how I created Evan.
And it was just so fascinating through this, because with it being inspired by a lot of the tragedy seen with COVID-19, but with it not being a direct cause, putting it into this situation. I mean, this is one of those scenarios that I've talked about with my family and all the different who's it, what's it's, and,
Of
you
course,
know,
of
if
course.
it's the plug versus feeding tubes and all these types of
Right,
things. It's
absolutely.
very relatable. Again, as opposed to some of the more traditional bad guys, villains in things.
Mhm, mhm. Well, I don't know exactly, I've always listened to my gut, and uh, good, bad, or indifferent. As I say, I haven't followed trends. I've never done a series, because a series character, because every new story that comes to me is a new story. But I've always listened to my gut, and when I was seeing these news stories and identifying, or trying, no, impossible to identify unless you're in that situation, but trying to identify with people who were going through situations like that. And then, as a storyteller, you think, well, as I said, what if? So that would be a horrible situation to be in. But what if?
Right.
And then the next what if was, okay, what if it wasn't his dearly beloved? What if
Right.
it was his ex-wife, with whom he'd had a scorched earth divorce years earlier, hadn't even seen her, and he discovers all of a sudden that he's got this responsibility. And I just thought, boy, have I ever put Zach in a pit and I'm throwing rocks at him. And then what if enter, the state prosecutor, Kate Lennon, and not only is she tough, and aggressive, and you've got to do this, but she lays it on him again. And then what if they're sexually attracted? So then you get into two moral dilemmas. So
After all, it is a Sandra Brown book, right?
but I had a lot of fun. And at the same time, I think, I hope, that in the reader's mind, I have provoked a lot of questions. What would, and the tagline that I wanted to be for this novel is, what would you do? What would you do? And when you step back and kind of take that, that profound question,
Mhm.
it brings up all of your, your morality, your level of faith, or do you have any faith, or what religious applications, family members who may oppose or agree or be pressuring you to do one way or the other. So it was like, given that situation, what would you do? At the same time, I think it was a very tense, suspenseful story. So the suspense for me, building it in as a novelist, as a writer, was, what's he going to do? How in the hell is he going to get out of this situation with everybody still liking him,
Mhm.
or even sympathizing with him or empathizing with him? So that was my challenge as a writer, is how do you make it suspenseful? And so that's why Eben had to come in,
Mhm.
and he's evil. You know it right away. And so really the struggle was within Zach, but then he also had this personification of Eben that he had to physically fight.
with this book, I mean, since it was partially inspired by COVID, and I know your previous book with Blind Tiger was more historical 1920s, even though you still had, the Spanish flu as a pandemic there, as it turns out. There's always seems to be, and like you said, you're following your gut. Do you think that a lot of the recent occurrences in the world right now and with the pandemic, do you think that's going to continue flavoring your work going forward, even if when you're trying to escape from it? Or
I think like everybody, I'm kind of sick of it. And no pun intended, but the reason, and I got COVID in July and I didn't even know I had it, but I took a test because I had sinus stuff, and my grandson had an emergency tonsillectomy, and I was going to go to the hospital, and I thought, well, I've got the Kleenex in my hand and I'm, blowing my nose and kind of coughing and everything. And I thought, people are going to be looking at me awry. And I thought, well, I probably ought to take a COVID test. And it came back positive. And I went, what? And I thought, well, it's a faulty test because it didn't wait the 15 minutes. It was like 15 seconds. And so I had another COVID test entirely, took it, and it was the same thing. So that's the only reason I had COVID. I was, God blessed, with a very, very, very mild case. I just stayed home for 10 days and was very lazy. But other than that, it was fine. But I think everybody is just so, we're kind of over it. Yeah. And in Blind Tiger, I was away in another location for 2 months away from home. I was finishing up Thick as Thieves. I finished Thick as Thieves, and the lockdown came, and I couldn't drive home. It was too far to drive without staying 1 or 2 nights in a hotel, and everybody's saying, don't go to a hotel. The airlines were shut down. So for 2 months, I was stuck. Wow. But and I got to thinking, how do you write a book, the kind of books that I write, where everybody's got a mask on? And so I thought, well, I'll just go back 100 years. So I thought, what was happening in 1920? Well, we had the Spanish flu epidemic. We had soldiers coming home from World War I with post-traumatic stress, and no, it hadn't been named back then. We had a women's movement. This was at the height of the Me Too. We had a women's movement, except it was about suffrage, and suffrage, the amendment went into effect that year. And as if all of that weren't enough, you couldn't even get a drink, because Prohibition started in January of 1920. So I thought, Prohibition, that'll be something interesting to write about. So I typed in Prohibition, Texas, 1920. Who knew? Who knew? But the moonshine, the moonshine capital of Texas, is like 40-minute drive from where I live, a town called Glen Rose. And it was geographically ideal for moonshine. And so I started doing all this research, and it was like, this is the most fun I've ever had in my life. I just loved it. And so I made my hero a soldier, cowboy, of course, because I love cowboys, from Fort Worth, Texas. And I had, him trying to get home. It's like the Odyssey. He's trying to get home, but he gets caught up in Foley, Texas. I didn't call it Glen Rose because they still have people over there who are related whose ancestors were the moonshiners. So anyway, I had more fun writing that book. I just had a ball, and I had to sell it to my editor by saying, I don't want to write about COVID. How do you write about, this? I said, however, and then I started drawing the parallels, which I've just laid out to you. And he said, that could really be fun. It could really be interesting. And then the book turned out to be, I usually write about 500 pages. It turned out to be about 650. But I just got embroiled in those characters and in their lives. And all of it was more or less documented because they did have a raid and there was an informer. And so I built all of that into the story.
Well, now you're usually contracted to write about one book a year, right?
Yes.
So what do you do with other ideas as they occur to you? I mean, do you put them in a bucket, or are they just kind of, oh, that's fun to kind of revisit, or do they just kind of disappear into the ether, never to be revisited again?
Well, if it's a really good idea, the trick is to know the difference between an idea and a story, because not every idea wants to be a story. And I have had lots of ideas, and people say, where do you get them? And in all honesty, and as God is my witness, I don't know. It comes from something so random, or I can hear a sentence of dialogue. There was going to be trouble in hell. He just wasn't in the mood for it. That was the first sentence of the first book of the Texas trilogy.
Wow.
And I have no idea where that came from. I just heard it and I wrote it down. I thought, who is this guy? And then I saw Lucky Tyler sitting at this bar, staring into his beer. A fight breaks out and there was trouble. And he was always in trouble, but he just wasn't in the mood for it. And then he gets in the brawl. Here comes his older brother, Chase. I didn't know he had a brother until Chase walked into the bar room, and they start slugging it out with everybody else. And so I called my editor and I said, I really think I'm on to something. But I said, I need to write these two books from the male point of view. Now, this goes back to like the late 80s when we had certain parameters if you were writing strictly, for romance. And she said, well, you can't do that. The books are written from the female point of view. You can't write from the male point of view. And I said, well, you kind of can. So I said, but if it'll make you feel better, I'll throw in a kid sister, a bratty kid sister. And this was during the oil crisis in Texas, a world crisis where everything was going to hell in a handbasket.
Oh, yeah.
And so I said, I'll throw in a kid sister. I want to make them longer than the typical love swept. I want to go another 100 pages. And that's where the Texas trilogy came from. But I don't know where that one sentence came from. I couldn't specify. Now, I've just given you an example of where Overkill came from. It was obviously news stories and the permeation of COVID and all of this stuff. So with each book, there's a way in which how the idea came into my head. But if I really knew the source of that, that's what I'd sell. I wouldn't spend 10 months of my life writing a book. I could just sell the idea and say, this is great. But an idea becomes a story when it is revealed to me, and sometimes it takes 1 hour and sometimes it takes 3 months, but an idea becomes a story when it is revealed to me, the one thing that I know that the reader doesn't.
Oh. Okay. And do you
So
keep
I
that
can-
then as like a constant reminder as you're then crafting everything
Exactly.
else?
It's the reason I sit down and write the book. It's the one thing. It's like my mother used to sew for my sisters and me. And I remember her doing the gathering thread. She would do 2 straight lines and then she'd gather our skirts and her gathering thread. And so I think of that as the gathering thread. It's the reason you're telling the story. It's the one thing that everything hinges. Now the character may know it all along. Character may be as surprised as the reader. But it is the one thing that I know that the reader doesn't know. It's the question I plant in the reader's mind at the end of the prologue or the first chapter and the first line, if I possibly can, but I plant it as early as possible, a question in the reader's mind. It's very subliminal, but I don't tell the answer until as far to the end of the book as I possibly can.
Well, that's
And
what I was going to
that's-
ask. Do you feel you always have to reveal that answer in the book? Or do you ever kind of keep that?
No,
Still
no,
a
no, no.
secret?
It's always, no, I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't do that to myself, but I wouldn't do that to the reader. I think it should be a satisfying ending. There may be some, there may be some questions left, but no, whatever that one thing is, it's revealed. And that's when I know that an idea wants to be a story. Why are you telling this?
Mhm.
What's the point of this story if you're not withholding? Because the art of seduction is withholding. And so as an author, I'm trying to seduce the reader to keep turning the pages. So I withhold until the very end. And you don't even know that the question's been planted in your mind, but it has. And in the case of Overkill, it was like, what is that going to do? I
Right.
wanted the reader to be worried about him on every single page. What is he going to do?
What's he going to do? How is he going to react? I mean, the scene where he first visited Rebecca in her hospital room and looking at it was a scene that just kind of gave chills.
Well,
So
that is so interesting you bring up that scene, because I have to confess, when I sent my first draft in, that scene wasn't in there. And I omitted it for a reason, because I didn't want this to become about the morbidity of Rebecca's condition. I didn't want it to be graphic and gruesome and off-putting, to the reader, like, oh, this is really, So I sent the book in without it. My chief editor read it. Another editor read it. They corresponded on their notes without talking to each other while they were reading it. They corresponded on their notes, and both of them came back with a note that a scene such as that needed to be in the book. And I was like, oh, y'all, I say y'all, oh, y'all, don't, don't make me do that. That's just going to be, so they go, well, it's up to you, of course, but they are my first two readers. And I had to think that it would represent hundreds of thousands of readers. So it was like, okay. So I deliberated for days and days and days over how I was going to write that scene. And I thought, it can't be about her. It's got to be about Zach.
Yeah.
And if I were in his shoes, so I put myself in his shoes, and if I'm walking into that room, what would I do? Avoidance. So I have him looking at everything else.
Every little detail in the room. Yes.
Window, the towels folded on the sink, he finally gets to the machinery, and then he gets to the tubes, and then all this leads he's only got one thing left to look at. But I just ended the chapter with, he gasped.
Which is exactly what I then did. I'm like, oh my gosh, wait, no. Okay.
And so I thought the better way to describe how he feels is not a meltdown in that room with her, but you find out how he feels in the next scene when he's talking to the doctor. And she says, do you need some water? And he's sweating and he's jiggling his knees, and he's, and this is a cool, calm guy who's played in the Super Bowl MVP quarterback, and he's falling apart, but trying really hard to keep it together. And I thought, isn't that the way most of us, I mean, at least, isn't that the way most males would react? And so that was how I wrote the scene. And when I sent it to the editor, I said, this is very short, but I think it addresses everything that you said it needed to. But he looked at everything in the room except her.
Right. Yeah, that was one that got me. It definitely did. I have a couple more questions that kind of spins off of the writing a little bit, because I know we started a little bit late, so we're going a little bit late because of the technical issues. But you mentioned your mom, and I know in an earlier interview, I heard that, and where you've talked about reading and being exposed to very lush, romantic books through your mother, and especially Taylor Caldwell, which stood out to me because those were books that my mother loved.
Oh gosh.
And she had all of those, and I've been going through them since she passed. And I'm like, oh my gosh. And they all bring back certain memories. Do you ever go back to those types of books and for a reread or other memories? Or
I love those. And it's not, here again, it's not trendy now, but I've always aspired to write kind of like a saga. And I think Blind Tiger and the two, Sunset Embrace and Another Dawn, were early in my career, but they were sequential books, and they were on the track of a saga where you would follow families, through generations. But I loved those books. I just loved those books. And I read Thomas Costain and, Lloyd C. Douglas, Leon Uris, all of those books that were just so rich and in detail, and you really got to develop the characters and everything. Nowadays, I'm aging myself, but nowadays, anything that lasts more than 20 seconds is borrowed time with someone's attention span, because a text is a thumbs up and that's it. That says everything. Well, I still believe in language. I still believe in, I want to be carried away into another world. I don't care how long it takes, and the longer the better. If it takes 3 weeks to read a book, or 3 nights, tell me a story. Tell me a story. And I want the richness of that tapestry. And so, yes, my father was the writer. He was an editorial writer for the newspaper. And so he had to go to work every day and write 500 words that would be printed in the paper the next day. But my mother was the romantic, and she loved reading stories, and she would tell us stories, and she would read, I say us because I have 4 younger sisters. So she would read the 5 of us, just stories. And she created in me a hunger for that storytelling. Tell me a story. And so I'm a perfect combination of her romantic vision of the world, that go on adventures and be Jane Eyre, and
Love that.
yeah. And then, but Daddy's work ethic. I mean, I come to work every day and put words on paper. And so the combination of the two, I guess, resulted in me, but I bless them both for giving me that, first of all, the love of storytelling and fantasy. Write out your fantasies. And the second is the discipline to do it.
Oh, wow.
Because it takes a lot of discipline to come to this keyboard every day and face a wall of fear. 84 books notwithstanding, they don't count. The one that
It counts for a lot, though, Sandra.
The one that you're working on is the only one that counts, and you've never done this before. That's the way I feel about it. It's like, how do I know how? I don't know how to do this. And I think that fear factor is healthy, actually, because it's a constant learning curve. It's a constant striving to be better, striving to keep that reader riveted to the page, because I started out as a reader, so I want to be riveted to the page. Every time I open the cover of a book, I'm like, oh, engross me, engage me, thrill me, delight me, make me scared, make me turned on, whatever it is. I want
You
that.
want that emotion, whatever that is.
I want
Yes.
a visceral reaction to that book. And so that's what I strive to do for my readers, is engage them, give them characters that they care about so that they're engaged. They want them to succeed, but oh my gosh, what's going to happen next?
One other question I had, and this is purely for me, because as I came across it in some of the research, you went on USO tours. I don't think I've ever heard of an author necessarily. I mean, that's not who I think of in going to USO tours. I think of Bob Hope, right?
Right, right. And Anne Margaret. And
Yes.
my little group, we told everybody we were the Dallas Cowboys cheerleaders incognito, but they didn't believe us. I can't imagine why. I was so blessed to be able to do this, and it came about in such a strange way. The USO had asked, the year before my tour, they had asked international thriller writers. They said, you write espionage, you write, about war and weaponry and stuff. So they had a group of 4 or 5 writers. I wasn't part of that, who went to Kuwait, and it was during the Iraq War. And I don't know for certain. I think they went into Iraq 1 or 2 days, but they were mostly meeting and greeting with the service members who were in Kuwait. So the next year, the it was Douglas Preston who had organized through the USO that tour. So one January morning, I'll never forget it. I was driving in my car and I got a call on my cell phone. I looked down, it was Doug Preston. I said, "Hey, Doug, how are you?" And he said, "Well, I'm great." He said, "I want to ask a favor of you, would consideration." He said, "The USO wants to send another group to the Middle East on a USO tour." And he said, "When we were over there, we saw your books everywhere." And he said,
Wow.
"The USO thinks you would be an incredible ambassador." And I was driving down the road, I almost ran off the road. I was like, I can't believe I'm hearing this. He said, "Would you even consider going?" I
Mm,
said,
wow.
"Oh my gosh, absolutely." I said, "But can I get back to you? Uh, let me think about this. Where would we be going?" He said, "Well, we're not saying yet." Uh, you know, and I said, "Okay." He said, "But it will be in the Middle East." I said, "Okay." And so I immediately hung up and I called my husband at the time and I said, "I just got the most extraordinary phone call." And I said, "I have been invited by the USO to go on a USO tour to the Middle East." And he said, "Well, you're going, aren't you?" And I said, "That's exactly the response I hoped that you would give me." So I called Doug back and I said, "Yes." And he said, "We're thinking of Kathy Wrights, who writes the Bone series, and
Mhm.
Clive Cussler, Mark Bowden, who wrote Black Hawk Down, and Andrew Peterson, another military writer." And I was like, "Oh my gosh,
Yeah.
I get to travel with Clive Cussler and room with Kathy Wrights. I can do that. How hard can it be?" Well, it was very hard. It was
Mhm.
very hard, but it was, and we went, after we went through all the clearance, you have to go through the DOJ clearance and everything. But after we had all been cleared, then they told us we were going to Afghanistan. And it was just, I was like, oh, and this was at the height of our war in Afghanistan. And it was like, if you don't do this, you will regret it the rest of your life. And my family was saying, "Well, you got to go. I wish I could go and carry your thing." I said, "I wish you could go and carry my thing too, because it weighs half my body weight."
Right.
And so, but we went and it was the most remarkable week of my life. I mean, it truly was. And I still talk about it and I look back on it and think of all the things that this career has afforded me the opportunity to do.
Who would have thought that, right?
So many Americans would give their eye teeth to be afforded this opportunity. And before, because I wrote a few stories, um, I was enabled to do it. And it was great. And then that was in 2011. And then in I don't remember what year it was, but it was a few years later, 4 or 5 years later, we went to it was me and Kathy again, and Brad Meltzer and Brad um, Taylor
Mhm.
and Kathleen Ingram, and we went to Guantanamo Bay.
Wow.
But it was the Afghanistan trip was the one where you really, I mean, we had to rough it. I did things I never would have thought I would do, but we flew in C-130s with the troops. We flew in Black Hawk helicopters, and when they say get on the helicopter, they
Get
mean
on
it.
the helicopter. Yeah. Right
and
then. Yep.
and we had, our gear and our helmets and our flak jackets, and it was an experience. Kathy and I still laugh about it. I talked to her last week, and it was just like, we harken back to our bee hut. They had to put it, which stands for base hut. It was built out of plywood. It was at Bagram Air Force Base in Afghanistan, and they had to put up a temporary plywood wall between our side and the men's side. So and there was, the bathroom was like 100 yards away, but we had a little porta potty outside our door, which we swore we'd never go to, but we ultimately said, okay, we got to.
Got to, yeah.
So we had, tales from the trenches and the opportunity to travel with, authors with the gravitas of Clive Cussler and Mark Bowden.
Wow.
I mean, it was just amazing. Yeah.
Wow. Well, that question was purely, thank you for indulging me on that one, because that was definitely a little bit outside of the norm. And we've gone way longer than we had anticipated. But how
That's
do our
okay.
readers stay in touch with you? What is the best way for them to keep track of what are you doing?
Oh gosh, I'm on my website is sandrabrown.net or com. I'm on Twitter. Let's see. What is my Twitter? You can find me.
Again, technology challenged, right?
Yes, Instagram and my Facebook, Sandra Brown. And then I have, what I would strongly urge everyone do is sign up for the Sandra Brown Ambassador Group. All you have to do is sign up, but it spans from around the world, and you get the inside skinny ahead of time, ahead of everybody else, and you get to talk to people all over the world about the books and what you're reading and everything. It's really interesting to visit that. It's the Sandra Brown Ambassador Group on Facebook. Yeah. So, but I am technologically challenged.
But see, Sandra, this is just the excuse of why we need to have an event with you in person here in Dallas. That way we can rule out all the technology aspects and sit down face to face.
I still don't know why I'm not on this camera. I just don't get it, but I'm looking at every single thing, and my camera shows that I am full on. So I don't know why.
No worries. We made it through. It's okay. But thank you again for joining us tonight. And if you'll stick around for some additional questions for our readers, that would be great.
Sure. Absolutely.
Great. Thanks again, Sandra.
You're welcome.